you would open up your Bibles to Galatians chapter 1. Galatians chapter 1. Last Sunday night we looked at and drew a lesson from one of the most often overlooked portions of the book of Galatians, and really of all of the letters of the New Testament. We got a message from the salutation, from Paul's greeting to the Galatian congregations. Now, I told you that in the first century, normally a letter contained a salutation, a section that was followed by a thanksgiving section. In every other letter that Paul wrote that is preserved for us in the New Testament, Paul follows this standard letter format. He tells who he is, who he's writing to, greets them, and offers some form of thanksgiving. Well, Paul kind of sort of skips that part in the book of Galatians. In the book of Galatians, he doesn't offer the thanksgiving. He sort of just jumps right in with both feet to the meat of the letter, to the theme of the letter. This omission, though, doesn't mean that Paul didn't care about the Galatians. It doesn't mean that he thought they were low down, no good, rotten scoundrels. Doesn't mean that he didn't think that they were worth anything. What it is simply saying is he couldn't wait to get to it. It shows actually his concern for them. He's not going to butter them up with flowery phrases and so forth. Paul will refer to the Galatians as his brothers at least 8 times in the book of Galatians. So he obviously loves these brethren dearly. He cares deeply for them. And he's concerned about them, which is also evident in the appeals that he makes throughout this short letter. He evidently, though, could not think of anything to commend them for. So he enters directly into the issues at hand. And what are those issues at hand? Well, I want to suggest 3 that are evident from verses 6 through 10 of Galatians chapter 1. Paul finishes the salutation and then he writes, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ." Paul begins this letter, the body part of his letter, by expressing great astonishment. Great astonishment at the Galatians. Now, let's talk for a few moments about Paul's astonishment and what it really was. He says, "I am astonished." Now, to you and me, that's just a way of saying he was astonished, right? Well, in conventional, this phrase, "I am astonished," was a conventional expression in Greek letters from about the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD. It signaled more than just astonishment, though, in that time period. In fact, it signaled astonishment, but also rebuke, disapproval, and disappointment. At times, this phrase could even be used to express, irony and irritation. It wasn't just the question of being astonished. There was a lot more involved in what this phrase signaled than just simple astonishment. Some scholars feel that Paul actually, in these first few words, is that he is rebuking the Galatians, even scolding the churches in Galatia. But Paul, and what they say is Paul is not really astonished, that Paul is irritated, that he is mad, that he is upset, and that he's letting them have it. This is what's known as the ironic rebuke view. But honestly, there's very little evidence that backs this up. As I mentioned earlier, he calls them brothers 8 times in the letter. Although there is a noticeably sharp tone to this letter, there's also the evidence of his love for them throughout the letter. More likely, we should take an astonishment rebuke view of Paul's feelings. Certainly he's displeased with his readers. Okay, there can be no doubt about that. Thus the lack of thanksgiving in this letter. But the note of astonishment in his rebuke is more prominent than the note of irritation or irony. So that tells us a little bit about his astonishment, but why? What are some reasons for Paul's astonishment? Let me give you 2, or actually let's let Paul give you 2 in actually 2 words in Galatians chapter 1 verse 6. One is the amount of time it took for the weeds or the thorns to choke the good seed. Now, that's a reference, of course, to the parable of the sower that Jesus told. How there were some seed that fell in thorny places, weeded areas, where the weeds and the thorns grew up, and they choked the good seed, making it unfruitful. And so Paul expresses astonishment that the bad had choked out the good so quickly. But also, not just that, but who they were deserting as well. The focus of Paul's astonishment, I believe, is this. The word used in secular Hellenistic society or Greek society, it was for one who left one school of thought for another. So who was it that they were deserting? Well, that's a good question. Were they deserting Paul? Well, because he says, deserting him who called you. Him who called you. So is that Paul? Because Paul called them with the gospel message? Not necessarily. Because he converted them? Was it Christ? Martin Luther and John Calvin both thought that it was Christ, the one who called you in grace. Or is there another option? Could it be that they were deserting God, the one who did the calling through the gospel, the grace of Christ, and the mouth of Paul? I think that might be the answer, is that they were deserting God. Because, well, quite honestly, David summed it up best in Psalm 51. Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So David realized that ultimately his sin was against all these other, but the bottom line was he sinned against God. And that may be the case here. The bottom line is that they were deserting God. Another point of astonishment for Paul here in Galatians 1 is his great astonishment at the quote-unquote different gospel. That word different is sort of interesting, because for that adjective different, there are actually 2 different Greek words that are used in very close proximity for the same English word, different. I've told you before, Greek is a very precise language. They have several different words where English has one word. This is another one of those interesting situations. Pardon me. But so the first word that Paul uses in the last part of verse 6 is a word that means another of a different kind. Okay? The second word that he uses for different in chapter 1, verse 7, the first part of the verse, means another of the same kind. Okay, so in verse 6, he uses the word another of a different kind. In verse 7, he uses the word for another of the same kind. All right? Very important to understand this difference. The second would be like comparing Coke and Pepsi. You know, you may have some very strong feelings, but the bottom line is they're pretty much the same. They're soft drinks, okay? Coke, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, whatever you want to throw in there, they're all pretty much the same. They're soft. No, they're not either. I understand. I have my preferences, okay? But go with me, okay? While I choke down this. So, another of the same kind. The first word that appears in verse 6, another of a different kind, would be like comparing Coke and, well, a book, okay? They're not anything alike, all right? They're not the same in the same category. Now, evidently, the Judaizers, which we learn a little bit about here, because he uses the word some, so evidently there were more than one. And not only that, but the present tense of the verbs let us know that they were still in Galatia. But they were saying that their message complemented Paul's message. That they were sort of continuing with what Paul had started telling them. That they were telling them things that Paul had sort of kind of left out. They would be using the second word, which is why he uses that second word in verse 7. Not that there is another one. But Paul, by using the first word first, Paul wants them to understand and to know that what they're teaching doesn't even remotely resemble what he taught them. I mean, it's not even like comparing apples to oranges because they're the same, they're both fruits. It's like comparing apples to a chair, okay? They're not even in the same classification. They're not in the same category. It doesn't even remotely resemble the gospel that he preached. And the resulting result was actually two things. Number one was confusion. Or troubled. The word as the English Standard Version uses, the word troubled here. The word means a troubling of soul and mind. So it's confusion. But not only that, also perversion or distortion, this version has. A changing of the gospel. Not a good idea to change the gospel that Jesus gave to them. Now, both of these are of political origin. The confusion of those who stirred up people, political agitators of turmoil and confusion. Perversion used with revolutionary action, particularly in view. In other words, these people want to change the gospel. They want to change the gospel into something that was exclusively for Jews. And if you weren't a Jew, then the gospel is not for you. And if you want to obey the gospel, that's all well and good. But if you're going to do it, you have to be a Jew and become a Jew first via circumcision, etc. Now, in the New Testament, both of these words are used more figuratively than in the political sense. But so Paul has great astonishment at at the fact that they're even giving the time of day to this different gospel. Then he moves from talking about great astonishment to speaking about greater authority. Verses 8 and 9. He begins these verses by saying, but even. Now in English, that word but doesn't mean a whole lot to us. But in Greek, again, they have had different ways of saying things. By using the term but, that's a very strong adversative. But Paul uses the strongest word that could be used. He's not messing around, okay? He's not trying to be nice. He's not trying to tickle their ears. He uses as strong of language as he could use. That kind of sort of fits with the character of the letter. And then he goes a step further. He intensifies it by using the word even. So, but even. Paul has in mind their confusion, the trouble that they're experiencing, and the perversion, the distorting of the gospel message that the Judaizers are doing. And he doesn't want to leave a doubt in their minds. He doesn't want them to even think for a second that the Judaizers could be right. Because what Paul is saying here is you have two choices. Either the Judaizers are right or I'm right. There's no gray area. There's no middle ground. There's no room for compromise. Either they're right or I'm right, and you've got to make your call as to who you're going to believe. So he does so with what's known as a third-class conditional sentence, which means what is expressed is a matter of some doubt. Now, this is the Greek language 101 for you, okay? Actually, it's probably closer to 201 or 301. But anyway, there are different classes of conditional sentences. That word if is what signifies a conditional sentence. This is a third-class conditional sentence. It's a matter of some doubt. In other words, Paul is making a doubtful but theoretically possible statement. What he's saying is, it's somewhat doubtful, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you. So it's doubtful that we would. It's doubtful that an angel from heaven would. But if we did, then let him be accursed. Notice also the authority of the gospel. The authority of the gospel. Notice that Paul's message and its authority is not in Paul or the preacher or his position or anything of that nature. Not the preacher or his position. It gets aggravating sometimes when people think that I'm special because I'm a preacher. That somehow I don't face the things that they face because I'm a preacher. I remember, I think I may have told you about playing golf. And there were three of us, and we caught up with a single, which is kind of weird. Okay, those of you who golf know that a threesome doesn't catch up with a single. Unless that single's just messing around, which this guy was, I guess. So anyway, he asked if he could play with us, and he was just letting out cuss word after cuss word after cuss word after cuss word. And finally, one of my friends that I was playing with from church, they said, "Oh, well, this is Carl. He's a preacher at the church we go to." And that guy spent 2 holes apologizing to me for his language. And I finally said, you don't need to apologize to me. You need to apologize to the one that's a little bit higher up than me. Okay? That's who you need to be apologizing to. The authority of the gospel is not in the preacher. The authority of the gospel is in the message. The authority and character of Paul and the preacher are unimportant. And Paul emphasizes that throughout the letter. Their authority is secondary to that of the gospel itself. The preacher derives his authority from his message, from the gospel, and not vice versa. Now, if you try to take away the gospel's authority, Paul has a word for you: anathema. What that means is delivered over to divine wrath for destruction. It's a translation of the Hebrew word bond. What is banned or bond is removed from ordinary circulation and given over to destruction. Sort of like if you have a major sports figure that has been found to be using performance-enhancing drugs on 3 or more separate occasions or whatever, they may receive a lifetime ban from that sport. What that means is they're dead to the sport. None of their records matter, none of their performance matters, because it was tainted. Well, another good example of this would be the city of Jericho. After the city of Jericho, the walls came down, the Israelites were given instructions. Those instructions were to completely, totally, utterly destroy the city. Now, Achan thought he had some better ideas for some of this stuff, and that got him into some trouble. Because when something was banned, it was to be given over to divine wrath for destruction. And that is what Paul says will happen to those who try to take away the gospel's authority. And he says it not only once, but he says it twice. The repetition is for emphasis, to let people know he's not messing around. He's not being cute. He is telling them the exact truth. In fact, verse 9 is a first-class conditional sentence. Okay? The condition is determined as fulfilled. He's stressing the reality of the situation. As we have said before, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. That if could accurately be translated since. That's what this conditional sentence means. Since they're preaching a gospel contrary to the one you received, they are accursed. They are delivered over to divine wrath for destruction. He knows that there are people in Galatia preaching a false gospel. And he knows that if anyone does, then they will come under the judicial wrath of God. Since they are preaching a gospel contrary to the one they received, they are delivered over to divine wrath for destruction. Because the gospel that Paul preached, had all of that greater authority than Paul or anyone else. Then he speaks also not just about great astonishment and greater authority, he speaks about the greatest approval in verse 10. See, apparently, there were some who said Paul was tickling their ears. That Paul was telling them what he wanted them to hear, because he knew that that he was preaching the part of the gospel they wanted to hear. Because if he preached them the part of the gospel that they wanted to hear, then he would be preaching to them the only part of the gospel they would accept. And the Judaizers come along and say, well, there was some more stuff that Paul left out. Paul's response, pretty simple, pretty emphatic. It's what the most recent commentators call an emotional outburst in a matter-of-fact tone. And it's in verse 10, the first part of the verse. He says, "For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man?" The Judaizers had told the Galatians that Paul really did believe in and preach the necessity of circumcision elsewhere in his mission, but that he had made a distinction between Jewish and Gentile Christians with regard to the Mosaic law. But in answer, Paul says that at least his language proves that he's not a flatterer or a tickler of ears. He says, I preach the gospel to you. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And then he comes to verse 10, the second part of the verse. He concludes with a second-class conditional sentence. And I remember all of this because in Greek, our professor was very keen on making sure we knew this, because we have a first, second, and third class conditional sentence all in the same context. But this is a second-class conditional sentence, where the condition is contrary to fact or untrue. It's the implied answer to the first two questions in verse 10. It's sort of like Jesus when he said in Matthew 6:24, you can't serve God and money. Okay? What Paul is saying here is you can't please God and man. Okay? You just can't do it. Paul has great astonishment at his Galatian converts so quickly accepting a pseudo-gospel, which really was not even a gospel at all. He then shows that the message of the gospel has greater authority than he or even an angel from heaven has. And finally, he tells them that he is after the greatest approval of all. God's approval, not man's approval. So may I ask you, whose approval are you seeking today? If you answer that question any way but God's approval, then you're trying to please the wrong person, the wrong being, and you need to repent. Because if Jesus were to return today, and you're trying to please yourself, or you're trying to please other people, or, well, you're trying to please anyone but God, then you're after the wrong one's approval. So start seeking His approval. Not just on Sunday, not just on Wednesday, but start seeking His approval every day. Make sure that you are after His approval each and every day. If we can help you to do that in some way this evening, we want to. Maybe you just privately need to ask God to help you be after His approval. Maybe you need to publicly confess that you haven't been seeking His approval in the things that you do, and that you want to start or restart by being baptized or by repenting and praying. Whatever the case is, don't leave here seeking anyone's approval but God's. If we can help you in some way to do that through a public response, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?